Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week of 473 Social Justice in the Labor Force. This week, we're going to be talking about poverty, employment, and disability. So, this is a really important topic this week, and we'll dive into this in a minute. But I just wanted to do a few housekeeping items first. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about your activities this week. A large proportion of people did significantly not as well on their assignment this week as they have in the past. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I was reading as I went through. So the really important thing, and I really want you to think about this as you move into your social justice essay outline, is that you need to answer the question that's given. Okay, so what I asked was if policy was an effective method for inclusion in employment, right? So I asked you to take a stance either for or against, and I specifically said do not sit somewhere in the middle, right? So I got a lot of responses that said this could be good, or I think this is a good idea, but people were not arguing whether this was effective or ineffective, and that's what I asked you to do. So it's really, really, really important when you're thinking about creating an argument that you take a stance. And I understand that sometimes people don't feel confident in fully taking a stance, but that's what I've asked you to do. And that's how you're going to earn marks on that, okay? And I think that's really important when you're thinking about writing your essay as well, is that you don't sort of say, well, I could, or I think this might be good, or whatever. You're gonna say you're taking this stance. So feminist disability studies supports and upholds the rights and dignities of women with disabilities in employment. I just made that up as a topic again, but I want you to understand, don't be wishy-washy about it. Take a stance, okay? And the I think and I reflected on aren't going to make as strong an argument as, the Canadian Charter of Human Rights says blah, 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 blah. This upholds this because, right? So I just think it's really important that you guys recognize this as we move forward, because it's really important to be able to take a stance and to confidently defend that stance. So people said, for example, I don't see anything as black and white, so this could or could not be. I'm not saying that's not a valid argument, but it's not what was asked of you in this assignment, okay? So be really careful and make strong arguments, and make sure you state what your argument is right up front. Because for a lot of the activities that I was reviewing, I sort of had to wade through and fish through to find what the argument actually was. One of the things that was really effective for me and really helped me with my writing is that you always want to be direct and clear, and you want to make it easy on your reader. So again, I will reiterate, as I do 10,000 times every semester, and people still choose not to listen to me, but I will say it one more time, is use subheadings, right? That makes it easy for your reader to understand where you're going. Make sure you state your argument, your thesis statement right at the beginning. And I think not only as a reader, but as a writer, that really helps you to guide where your paper is going, right? So if you remember that sort of thesis statement, argument, three main topics, conclusion, right? And you don't always have to write that way, but I think especially when you are learning to write, when you are getting better at writing, to use that kind of formula is very helpful in creating a solid argument. So that's what I had to say about that. Okay, so again, this week we're going to talk about poverty, disability, and employment. People with disabilities live in poverty on a much higher scale than people without disabilities. So there's this cycle. And so if you can imagine sort of three pieces around the cycle being disability, poverty, and vulnerability to poverty and ill health. And these three things are cyclical and perpetuate each other. So if we think about social and cultural exclusion and stigma. If we think about the denial of opportunities for economic, social, and human development. If we think about reduced participation in decision making, and a deficit in economic, social, and cultural rights. We see all of these things that impact poverty for disabled people. And I don't have a stat off the top of my head right here, but there's a very significant overrepresentation of poverty for people with disabilities. So one of the things I want to point out, because I find there's often sort of a misunderstanding of income assistance benefits or social welfare. So when we talk about welfare now, that's not income assistance, as we used to call it welfare, but social welfare is generally more talking about how people are taken care of overall. So Canadian Pension Plan, income assistance, employment insurance, subsidized daycare, those types of things. So when we talk about income assistance, what I find with a lot of students is that they assume that most people with disabilities are on AISH. So AISH is Alberta Income for the Severely Handicapped, and that is specifically what it means. So AISH is only available to people who are considered severely disabled and unable to work. Okay, so we have 3 categories of income assistance here in Alberta. We have AISH. Like I said, we have people with barriers to full employment, so people with disabilities but are still expected to work. And then we have regular income assistance as well. So people often hear, and there's a lot of media coverage about, income assistance fraud and things, which is actually very, very minimal. It's a very small cost in the overall bucket. But people who are on AISH are people who are determined by the government as unable to ever work, right? They are not people who can work. So that amount that people, and it's just gone up, which is awesome, but still it's $863 a month, and that is including your home costs, right? So in general, people on AISH tend to have about, after they've paid for their food and lodging, tend to have about $200 a month to spend. So if you can imagine yourself for the rest of your life, not for 1 month, not for 2, and we think back to that DIA making the month activity that we did, but it's not just 1 month you're trying to get through, it's month after month after month after month after year, after your whole life. That's the amount that you get and can expect to get for the rest of your life. The other thing I found when I worked in employment services is many people with disabilities were not on any other kind of income assistance. They were on regular income assistance. So a lot of what I did when I was working as an employment counselor was help people to work with an advocate to get set up on what would be the equivalent to the barriers to full-time employment. So this means you have an ongoing condition that you might not be able to work full-time ever, or that there are certain barriers to your employment. It might be cyclical, but people who get the barriers to full employment benefit here is $959 a month. So again, just think about your rent. $959 is not very much. It won't cover very much, especially when we think about access to transit passes. We think about rising food costs, right? All the things that were in that making the month activity with DIA. Regular income assistance, so for people who are expected to work, is $824. So this is all based on a single person, just because that allows us to compare sort of apples to apples. So $824 a month, that's to cover all of your costs. Just as a comparator to BC, we have in BC, regular income assistance is $560 a month, plus up to $500 for shelter. So that's a total of $1,060. Again, think about the cost of living in much of BC. and think about trying to live on $1,060 a month, including your rent. In the same sort of category as the barriers to full employment, there's a category called PPMB, persons with persistent and multiple barriers, that they have in BC, and that's 610 plus 500 for shelter. And then PWD is the equivalent of AISH, so persons with disabilities benefit, which is $983 plus 500 for shelter. So if we think about disability, and we think about poverty, and we think about income assistance and social welfare, people with disabilities who aren't able to work or who are having barriers to employment are facing very, very difficult realities in terms of how much they can bring in on income assistance. And again, I want you to think about that not through your sort of 18 to 20-year-old student lens, but also through your 40, your 50, right? This is your whole life. So anyways, that's just the stark reality here. Okay, so this is not uplifting. And so again, there's something called the deprivation index that looks at 7 domains of deprivation, and that's income, employment, education, health, crime, barriers to housing and services, and living environment. So all of those things are also impacted by your income, which is the biggest factor on that index. So when we're thinking about social welfare and how this is, people with disabilities who aren't able to be employed, who are able to be employed part-time or only in specific, seasons or jobs, we think about things like minimum wage. So again, I would encourage you, if you don't know already, to look up what is the minimum wage in Alberta. What is it in the province you come from, in the province you live in? Look at the ideas of living wage. What does it mean to have a living wage? Look at employment assistance, hardship assistance like EI, medical EI, and then sort of taking some thought into is that punitive or is it supportive? Because we see in many other countries where they provide a much higher rate of income assistance, of workers' compensation, for example, and people go to work and back to work at much higher rates. But our system provides people with the minimum, or not even the minimum, of what they're able to earn, of what they need to earn to get by. So it's much harder to get out of that system, out of that hole you dig yourself into. So, sorry, I'm just looking through my notes here. The other thing that comes up often is income assistance deductions. So again, I encourage you to take a look at this. So if you're earning money on regular benefits or barriers to full employment, there is a point at which the government claws back your money. So there is a certain amount you're allowed to make, and then after that, they take back dollar for dollar what you earn. So we have to think about, too, incentive to earn for people, or punishment when they no longer receive medical benefits, for example, if they're not on income assistance anymore. Sorry, my dog is eating a pillow right here, and I'm trying to deal with her. Mitchie, stop. Stop. So anyways, yeah, that is what I wanted to say about poverty and disability and employment. And I think that when we think about labor force participation, when we think about social justice, how can we really consider that it is socially just to pay someone who has been deemed unable to work less than they need to live, to buy not organic fancy blueberries in February, but the basic necessities, right? Healthy, nutritious food, access to education, access to transit to be able to get around. So I want you to really think about that, and how can we as a society possibly think that it is just, socially just, to do that? And then what does that mean looking at that from the other side? So people argue that people will not work and are lazy, and taking away from my income through my taxes to pay for other people isn't fair, and that's not socially just. So I want you to just give that some thought as you move forward with this week. Okay. As I mentioned before, Crystal will be tomorrow, Wednesday at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. She'll be on Zoom to answer any extra questions about the social justice outline. And that is due on Friday. So I'm really excited to take a look at those when they come through. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you guys later.